Hook. The moment this shy Filipino teenager opened his mouth, the entire AGT arena froze in shock. Nobody expected a kid from a tiny village to sound exactly like Elvis Presley, but within seconds, the judges were staring at each other in disbelief. What happened next changed his life forever. Before we begin, subscribe now and join our family for more unbelievable talent stories that will leave you speechless. The lights inside the America's Got Talent theater glowed brighter than ever as thousands of people filled the seats waiting for another long day of auditions. Some came to laugh, some came to cry, others came hoping to witness a moment they would never forget. The judges sat behind their giant desk sipping coffee while producers rushed backstage trying to keep the show moving. Contestants stretched their voices, practiced dance moves, and whispered prayers under their breath. It looked like an ordinary audition day, but nobody inside that building knew they were about to witness one of the most unforgettable performances in AGT history. Backstage stood a skinny 16-year-old Filipino boy named Miguel Santos. He wore a simple black jacket his uncle had borrowed from a neighbor because his family could not afford expensive clothes. His shoes were slightly worn out, and his hands trembled as he held the contestant number attached to his shirt. Around him were singers with vocal coaches, dancers with expensive costumes, and performers surrounded by managers. Miguel stood alone. He looked down at a tiny picture tucked into his pocket. It was a photograph of his mother smiling beside a small karaoke machine back in the Philippines. That karaoke machine had changed his life. Miguel grew up in a poor fishing village near Cebu. His father worked long exhausting hours at sea while his mother sold homemade snacks near the market. Electricity often failed during storms, and their house leaked whenever heavy rain came. Yet despite the hardship, music filled their tiny home every single night. Miguel's mother adored Elvis Presley. She played old recordings constantly through a dusty radio that barely worked. While other children listened to modern pop stars, Miguel listened to Can't Help Falling in Love, Jailhouse Rock, and Suspicious Minds. At first he copied the songs for fun, but one evening something strange happened. When Miguel was only 8 years old, he sang an Elvis song during a family gathering. The entire room suddenly became silent. His uncle stopped talking. His cousins stared at him wide-eyed. His grandmother began crying softly. Because the voice coming out of that little boy did not sound like a child at all. It sounded exactly like Elvis Presley. Word spread quickly through the village. Neighbors crowded outside their house just to hear him sing. Some thought it was impossible. Others believed he was lip-syncing. One old fisherman even crossed himself and whispered that the spirit of Elvis had returned. But Miguel never cared about fame. He only loved seeing his mother smile whenever he sang. Years passed, and his voice grew even more unbelievable. Videos recorded on cheap phones began spreading online. Millions watched clips of the Filipino teenager whose voice sounded frozen in time. Yet despite the growing attention, life remained difficult. His father became sick and could no longer work consistently. Bills piled up. Food became scarce. Miguel almost gave up singing entirely to help support his family. Then one afternoon, a message arrived from an AGT producer. At first Miguel thought it was fake. America's Got Talent wanted him to audition in Los Angeles. His mother cried for an hour straight after reading the email. His father sat quietly staring at the wall because they had no money for plane tickets, hotels, or travel documents. The dream seemed impossible, but their village refused to let the opportunity disappear. Neighbors held fundraising events. Fishermen donated part of their earnings. Teachers organized small concerts at school. A local bakery even sold Elvis bread to raise money for Miguel's trip. Slowly enough funds were collected to send him and his mother to America. It was the first time Miguel had ever left the Philippines. Now, standing backstage at AGT, fear overwhelmed him. What if Americans laughed at him? What if the judges hated him? What if he forgot the lyrics? A producer approached him gently. "You're up next." Miguel swallowed hard and walked toward the stage entrance. The crowd cheered politely as he stepped into the spotlight. The theater looked enormous compared to the tiny karaoke contests back home. He could barely breathe. The judges smiled warmly. "How are you?" one judge asked. "I'm very nervous," Miguel admitted. The audience laughed softly. "Where are you from?" "I'm from the Philippines." The crowd erupted in cheers. One judge leaned forward curiously. "And what will you be doing for us today?" Miguel hesitated before answering. "I will sing Elvis Presley." The judges exchanged amused looks. They had heard thousands of Elvis impersonators before. Most were cheesy entertainers in shiny costumes trying too hard to imitate the legend. Nobody expected anything extraordinary from this shy teenager. One judge even smirked slightly. "All right, Miguel. Good luck." The music started. For one brief second, Miguel closed his eyes and imagined himself back home beside his mother's karaoke machine. Then he sang. The reaction was instant. The entire theater gasped. One judge's jaw literally dropped open. Another covered her mouth with both hands. Audience members shot up from their seats screaming in disbelief. Because the voice echoing through the theater sounded exactly like Elvis Presley in his prime. Not similar. Not inspired by. Identical. Miguel's tone carried the same velvet richness, the same emotional depth, the same legendary power. Every note felt impossible coming from a teenager standing alone under the lights. The audience exploded into cheers before the first chorus even finished. Backstage producers stared at monitors in total shock. Camera operators forgot to move their cameras because they were frozen listening to the performance. One elderly woman in the crowd burst into tears. The judges kept looking at each other as if asking silently whether this was real. Miguel continued singing with growing confidence. For the first time all day, his nervousness disappeared completely. He moved naturally across the stage, channeling the spirit of old-school rock and roll without feeling fake or forced. The crowd clapped along wildly. Then came the first twist nobody expected. Halfway through the song, the music suddenly stopped. Complete silence filled the theater. Miguel froze. Technical failure. The audience murmured in confusion while producers panicked backstage. Equipment malfunction during an audition could destroy a contestant's momentum completely. One judge apologized quickly. "Sorry, something happened with the track." Miguel stared down at the floor. Fear returned instantly. This was his big chance, and now everything was collapsing. Then from the audience, someone shouted, "Sing without the music." The crowd roared in agreement. Miguel looked uncertain. A judge smiled warmly. "Can you do it a cappella?" He took a deep breath. Then he began singing again completely alone without instruments. And somehow it became even more magical. Every note echoed perfectly through the silent theater. The rawness of his voice sent chills across the room. Audience members held their breath listening to the unbelievable purity of his singing. By the final chorus, people were openly crying. When he finished, there was 1 second of stunned silence before the entire theater erupted into the loudest standing ovation of the season. The judges stood clapping wildly. One judge shook his head in disbelief. "Miguel, I have judged talent competitions for years, and I have never heard anything like that in my life." Another judge wiped tears from her eyes. "You transported us back in time." The third judge leaned forward seriously. "You are not pretending to be Elvis. You are honoring him in the most beautiful way possible." Miguel smiled shyly as tears formed in his own eyes. Then suddenly the crowd began chanting his name. "Miguel! Miguel! Miguel!" Backstage producers rushed around frantically because social media was already exploding. Clips of the audition spread online within minutes. People across America began posting reactions calling him the Filipino Elvis. But the biggest shock was still coming. The head judge turned toward the others. "I think we may have found something special today." He slowly reached toward the golden buzzer. The audience screamed instantly. Miguel covered his mouth in shock. The judge paused dramatically before speaking again. "Not because you sound like Elvis, but because you reminded the world why music matters." Then he slammed the golden buzzer. Gold confetti exploded across the theater like fireworks. Miguel collapsed to his knees crying as the audience roared louder than ever before. His mother ran onto the stage sobbing uncontrollably and hugged him tightly while golden confetti rained around them. It became one of the most emotional moments in AGT history. But Miguel's journey was only beginning. After the audition aired, his life changed overnight. Millions followed him online. News stations across the world requested interviews. Music producers called non-stop. Elvis fans debated endlessly whether his voice was the closest imitation ever heard. Yet fame brought unexpected problems too. Some people accused him of lip-syncing. Others claimed his voice was edited by television producers. Online critics attacked him saying nobody could naturally sound like Elvis. The pressure became overwhelming. One night Miguel sat alone in his hotel room reading cruel comments online. Doubt consumed him. Maybe he really was just a gimmick. Maybe people would stop caring eventually. Then his mother entered quietly. She placed the old photograph from home beside him. "Remember why you sing," she whispered. "Not for fame. Not for television. For love." Miguel nodded slowly. The next round of AGT arrived quickly. This time expectations were enormous. The entire country waited to see whether the Filipino teenager could possibly deliver another unforgettable performance. Backstage, contestants whispered nervously about him. "That's the Elvis kid. No way he can top the audition. He's probably a one-hit wonder." Miguel heard every word. When he stepped onto the stage again, the judges smiled excitedly. One asked, "So Miguel, how has life changed since the Golden Buzzer?" He laughed nervously. "Very crazy." The audience cheered. Then the judge asked the question everyone wanted answered. "Tonight, are you singing Elvis again?" Miguel paused. Then he shook his head. The audience gasped. "I will sing my own version of a modern song, in Elvis style." The judges looked intrigued. The music started softly. And suddenly Miguel transformed a modern hit song into something that sounded straight out of the 1960s. It was brilliant, fresh, emotional, and completely unexpected. The crowd went insane. Even younger audience members who barely knew Elvis began screaming with excitement. By the end of the performance, the judges were on their feet again. One judge shouted, "You just reinvented an entire generation of music." Miguel advanced easily to the semi-finals. But another twist waited around the corner. Days before the semi-finals, Miguel received devastating news from home. His father had been rushed to the hospital after collapsing at sea. Doctors discovered serious heart problems requiring expensive treatment. Miguel felt crushed. He considered leaving AGT immediately to return home. Producers worried he might quit the competition entirely. The night before rehearsals, Miguel sat alone backstage fighting tears. That was when one of the judges unexpectedly approached him privately. "I heard about your father," the judge said softly. Miguel nodded silently. The judge placed a hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes the people we love need us to keep fighting, even when it hurts." Those words changed everything. The next night Miguel walked onto the semifinal stage carrying enormous emotional weight. Instead of singing an energetic Elvis classic, he chose, "If I Can Dream," one of Elvis Presley's most emotional songs. The performance became legendary. Miguel poured every ounce of fear, pain, hope, and love into the lyrics. His voice cracked with raw emotion during the final chorus, making the moment feel heartbreakingly real. Audience members cried openly. One camera captured a judge wiping tears repeatedly. When the song ended, the theater stood in silence for several seconds before exploding into applause louder than thunder. Even backstage crew members were crying. The performance immediately went viral worldwide. Celebrities shared clips online. Radio stations replayed his audition. Newspapers called him the rebirth of Elvis' spirit. But the greatest moment came later that night. A famous music producer approached Miguel backstage with an offer for a recording contract. His dream was becoming real. Yet AGT still had one final challenge. The grand finale. Only two contestants remained. Miguel and a world-famous dance group favored heavily to win the competition. Experts predicted Miguel would lose because singers rarely defeated massive dance productions with spectacular visuals. The pressure was unbearable. Hours before the finale, Miguel received a video message from his village back home. Hundreds of neighbors gathered together holding candles outside his family's tiny house. One by one they spoke directly into the camera. "We believe in you. You carry our dreams. You already made us proud." Miguel cried watching the message. That night he stepped onto the AGT finale stage calmer than ever before. No fear, no doubt, only gratitude. The lights dimmed completely as a single spotlight illuminated him alone at center stage. Then he began singing, Unchained Melody. The theater fell silent instantly. This performance felt different from every other round. Miguel no longer sounded like a nervous teenager trying to impress judges. He sounded like a true artist telling his life story through music. Each note carried heartbreak. Each lyric carried hope. By the final high note, people in the audience were standing on chairs screaming. The judges looked completely overwhelmed. When the song ended, confetti cannons exploded while the crowd roared endlessly. One judge spoke with tears in her eyes. "Miguel, tonight you were not the next Elvis Presley. Tonight you were the first Miguel Santos." The audience erupted again. Then came the results. The host stretched the tension endlessly before finally announcing the winner of America's Got Talent. The theater became completely silent. In third place, not Miguel. In second place, still not Miguel. Then the host smiled. "The winner of America's Got Talent is Miguel Santos." The building exploded with noise. Miguel collapsed to the floor crying uncontrollably as fireworks erupted around the stage. His mother screamed with joy while judges rushed forward hugging him. A poor teenager from a small Filipino fishing village had just become the champion of America's biggest talent competition. But perhaps the most emotional moment happened after the cameras stopped rolling. One of the judges quietly handed Miguel a phone. On the screen was his father calling from the hospital back home. Weak but smiling. "You did it, son." Miguel cried harder than ever before. Months later, Miguel released his first album blending classic Elvis-inspired vocals with modern music. It topped charts internationally. He performed sold-out concerts across America, Europe, and Asia. Yet despite the fame, he never forgot where he came from. Every concert ended the same way. Miguel would hold up the old photograph of his mother beside the karaoke machine and tell the audience, "Dreams can come from the smallest places." And every single time, the crowd stood cheering for minutes. Because his story reminded people that greatness does not depend on wealth, fame, or connections. Sometimes greatness begins in a tiny village, beside a broken karaoke machine, with a boy brave enough to sing from his heart. And somewhere out there tonight, another kid with impossible dreams might hear Miguel's story and decide not to give up. Before you go, tell us in the comments which part of the country you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more emotional talent stories that will inspire your heart.